So glad that you have chosen to join us, to celebrate with us on this Christmas Eve. If you are visiting with us for the first time, consider filling out one of those Connect cards that are in the pews with you. You can put them in the offering plates when they come around later. But we are glad you're here. You know, some say that the preacher's message at Christmas Eve services is kind of like the preacher's message at a wedding. Not everyone who's there wants to really be there. But in both instances, no one's really listening because everyone's thinking about what happens after. That's always how it is, right? Well, my hope tonight is that whatever your reason for being here, whether it's more out of obligation to a family member or a friend, maybe just out of curiosity, maybe because it's just one of those times you feel like you're supposed to go to church, or maybe you're one of those people that wouldn't miss Christmas Eve services for the world. But whatever your reason for being here, whatever your belief and understanding of God may or may not be and the person of Jesus, my hope tonight is simply that you'll do yourself the favor of being fully present. Fully present. Now, it's a challenge, I know. We've actually talked about this on our Sunday mornings in a message series that we've been in called The Great Christmas Giveaway. We've talked about the importance, especially in our culture, of being fully present. Because far too often, those that we share life with, they get splinters of our divided attention, leftover fragments of competing allegiances. And we end up short-circuiting the life-giving sharing in those relationships because we're not fully present enough to fully be in the moments. Our brain's somewhere else. It's a healthy reminder to all of us as we gather with family and friends this holiday season. But beyond that, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, the invitation to us this Christmas is to be fully present with God. Ultimately, so we can position ourselves to fully experience His presence, to welcome Him and His presence into our moments, into our lives this Christmas. So I want to explore that together tonight. Kitty read for us that classic section of the Christmas story found in Luke chapter 2. And I know that for many of us, that story has come to represent part of the feel-good magic of Christmas, right? We hear that passage and it stirs our minds with memories of a wide-eyed childhood Christmas morning, of holiday TV classics, of seeing the neighborhood Christmas lights in the snow. It all blurs together as part of the magic of Christmas for many of us. And I'm not here to spoil all that. But I would like to help us maybe re-explore and reframe what's actually taking place in that story, because I think it speaks to us in a very real way about experiencing God's presence in our lives. So I want to see if we can look at our beloved Christmas story this evening with a fresh set of eyes and ears and see what we can take to heart on this Christmas Eve together, okay? Here's how I want to approach that. I want to hinge tonight on the word hospitality. Hospitality. Now, I lived in the South for a period of time. I was in Georgia for about 3 years, and so there's the Southern hospitality thing, which in my experience is all fake, but that's a whole other thing, okay? So obviously, this time of year, where a lot of us are sharing our time and our homes and our meals with extended family and friends, but to you classically trained graduates of the Emily Post School of Etiquette, no, we're not talking tonight about how to hang your overcoats of your guests wrinkle-free, or how to fold your table napkin, which is the correct pâté knife to go on the pimento spread. None of those things, okay? Let's think in a much broader sense. Let's use this as our working definition. Hospitality, the warm and generous reception of guests, visitors, or strangers, often at notable personal cost or sacrifice. You need to know this. Middle Eastern hospitality is legendary. They pretty much wrote the book on the topic, okay? One traveler to the Middle Eastern region described it like this: extravagant hospitality where it's most needed and least deserved. You see, there's this societal fabric of self-obligation to ensure the well-being of neighbors and visiting strangers. It's an extravagant hospitality where the term itself is not just about providing guests with food and accommodations as best as possible, but it's about genuinely establishing, cultivating, and deepening the equity of the relationship. You see, the Middle Eastern cultures have this belief in hospitality that joyful living and even society itself rises and falls on the presence, the quality, and the depth of the relationships. This is not just about P's and Q's. It's genuinely about investing in, sustaining, and deepening and enriching relationships because they are what make our lives worth living. And that has been a cultural cornerstone of Middle Eastern cultures passed down through the generations for thousands of years. The time of Jesus in the first century was no exception. So let's use that lens to look again at our familiar Christmas story, how we can properly understand Luke's gospel in terms of that cultural context, okay? We're going to break it down into two sections. Let's start with the first half of our account that we heard read. Okay? Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Many older translations, even ones from just a few decades ago, said, no room for them in the inn. That kind of stuck. That's the phrase that most of us remember. There was no room for them in the inn. The story is so deeply ingrained in our consciousness that we fail to recognize ways we may have misunderstood or misread important information. In Christmas pageants all over America, we have scenes of pregnant Mary on a donkey arriving in Bethlehem at night, ready to burst, a stone-faced innkeeper who holds up a no vacancy sign, and some local farmer that shrugs and points to an abandoned stable where the Holy Family gives birth alone that night in a field. The stable's livestock their only companions. But is that right? Is Joseph really this ill-prepared chump who fails to make any preparations for his wife, who's pregnant with the Son of God? And is Bethlehem really this cold-hearted town that sends a pregnant woman and her husband to a crude lean-to in a farmer's field to give birth alone? And all of this goes down in a culture that has been writing the book on hospitality for thousands of years. Something's not adding up. But if we read the text thoroughly and through the proper historical lens, we not only discover our own misreading, we discover, I believe, a richer picture to take with us this Christmas of our Savior come to earth. So let's dig in a little bit here together. Because the account that's so often rendered in pageants and in Hallmark nativity sets doesn't really sync with the historical context. And I think the real picture is even more heartwarming and soul-stirring than we knew previously. So there was a census. We talked about that this past Sunday. Joseph and Mary are returning to Bethlehem, the village of Joseph's origin, his hometown. Now, in the Middle East, family heritage and connection to one's village of origin, it is long and rich. Joseph could have appeared in Bethlehem and said, I am Joseph, son of Heli, son of Mattat, son of Levi, and just about any home in that town would have been open to him. Add that to the reality that Joseph was also a royal. He was from the line of King David. And being from that lineage, any home in town would have been honored to have him as their guest. Add to that reality that in every culture, now and through history, a woman about to give birth is always given special attention and consideration. Was there no sense of honor in Bethlehem? Surely at some level that community would have sensed its responsibility to help one of its kin find adequate shelter in a time like this. To turn away a descendant of David and his pregnant wife would have been unspeakable shame on this entire village in that culture. And add to that, Mary also had relatives in a nearby village. A few months before Jesus' birth, Mary had visited her cousin Elizabeth. Where? Luke chapter 1 tells us, in the hill country of Judea. Bethlehem was located in the center of Judea. So if Joseph had failed to find adequate shelter in Bethlehem, he could naturally have headed just a few miles to Mary's extended family. But what's going on here? Did he not have time? Did Mary's water break or something? The text itself gives us a clue. It says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. The King James Version actually says, while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. Maybe you've only heard that line from the Charlie Brown Christmas special. I don't know, they read the King James Version in that one. But the original language here suggests that there was a passage of time, a period of some days before Mary gave birth, not the same night they arrived. There would have been time to secure adequate accommodations. So you take the sum total of all this, and it just doesn't seem to add up. Joseph could have easily found shelter in his home village. He was a descendant of King David, so any home would have been honored to have him. Mary had relatives nearby she could have used but didn't. A Jewish culture known for hospitality most certainly would have come to the assistance of a young mother, and there was time to arrange accommodations. So what's going on here? How are we to understand this story? I think it comes down to two simple questions. What was the manger, and what was the inn? And here's where our hospitality backdrop really starts to come alive. Because when we use that historical context to answer those questions, not only does the story suddenly make sense, but we also gain a richer understanding of how we can respond. So what's the manger? To us, that word invokes ideas of barns and stables, but in first century Middle Eastern villages, it's different. The only people who had barns, separate storage and care facilities for animals, were the richest of the rich. Simple common village homes in this region often had two rooms. One was specifically for guests. These guest rooms were often just attached to the main home or even on the roof. The other room of the home was the main room, the family room. This is where the entire family cooked, ate, lived, and slept. And at the very end of the main family room, sometimes just a couple steps, couple feet lower, since it's on a hillside, was an area maybe blocked off with heavy timbers. And each night into that little entry section, the family cow, donkey, maybe a sheep or two would be brought in for the night. Every morning, the same animals were taken out, tied up in a courtyard, and the area would be cleaned out for the day. Look at this picture. This is a pretty standard type of home in this region. Still existing today, built into a hillside. Bethlehem is in the hill country, and text says that Joseph and Mary went up to Bethlehem. You can see the lower area. Then the upper part of this home has the guest quarters attached. Now you see that lowest area on the house on the left side of the screen. That's the area where the family animals would be brought in for the night. And in this picture here, the main family room would be just the center area of the house. Look at this next picture, though, because this is a basic aerial view of just the main family room, of the lower area where the animals slept. Those oval things there, those are the mangers. They were either sections cut into the high floor of the family room, or they were wooden structures that were elevated right there. The idea was that when the animals came in, that would put those manger areas right at about standing height for the animals that were back there, okay? These types of homes were very common throughout the Old and the New Testaments, throughout historical documentation. Feel free to do your own research on that. They were very well known. William Thompson, he was a 19th century Arabic-speaking missionary scholar. He said this over 100 years ago. The birth took place in an ordinary house of some common peasant, and the baby was laid in one of the mangers, such as are still found in the dwellings of farmers of this region. So Jesus was born in a manger that was the family room of a common two-room peasant home. But what about the inn? Well, now that we've looked at these common homes, this is simple. It just comes down to original word choice. The old saying, lost in translation, can apply here. The gospel writer Luke had two main words available to him to describe this inn. Go ahead and put those on screen. The first word is the one used to refer to a commercial inn, hotel, a lodge of some establishment. It's the word that Luke uses in the story of the Great Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. The guy had been beaten up and left on the roadside, and he was taken to an inn, and the Samaritan paid for his lodging and his care while he was there. That's the first word. The second word you see is the word that referred almost exclusively to the guest quarters of common homes, either attached to one end of the room or on the roof. This is the word Luke chooses in Luke chapter 22 when Jesus is asking, where's the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? The upper room that many of us are familiar with, where the Last Supper took place, that's what this word is. It's the guest quarters of a common home. And it's why the updated NIV version that I referenced says guest room, but the older one that Kitty read still said inn. We're kind of realizing this over time. You see, all that's happening here is the home where Joseph and Mary came to stay already had its guest quarters occupied. Because very often, Middle Easterners would often eagerly and dutifully take in unannounced visitors and strangers due to their deep commitment to hospitality. So Joseph and Mary arrive, possibly at a predetermined home. We don't know. The homeowner has them come in and stay in the family room with them. One of the mangers becomes a baby bed. And with that arrangement, Mary not only has a warm and secure place to give birth, she now also has the support and hospitality of a host family. Do you see how from top to bottom, this suddenly becomes a picture of care and nurturing and hospitality rather than a picture of isolated abandonment? The symbolism of this verse gets brought out in much even richer terms in Matthew 5 when Jesus, the light of the world, says this: "A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." Jesus, the light of the world, was born into a house just like that, giving light to everyone in it. Now, when we look at the remaining half of our traditional Christmas story text, it gets better. Let's put that up on screen. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." So the very first people to hear about Jesus' birth, other than the host family in the home, were shepherds. Now, in this society, shepherds were close to the bottom of social ranks. Except now this can make sense in our context because it's a common peasant village with shepherds in the fields nearby. This was their place. And now our text says the angel appears to them and they're terrified because of course they are. They're being visited by some divine presence. But beyond that, it maybe can also make sense that they may be fearful of this promised Messiah that they've read about, come to save his people. He was finally here, and they were invited to visit him? Shepherds? Us? We don't belong in the presence of a king. Hey, God, do you see who you're talking to here? We can't just show up at the birthplace of the Messiah. We're going to be mocked and driven away. Not sure if you knew this, but we're bottom of the food chain, God. See, this is why it suddenly makes sense that the angel, after he tells them not to be afraid, they're told that their sign, their indication that they're welcome, is they will find a baby wrapped in cloths lying in a manger. Suddenly the shepherds come alive because that's how peasant women wrap babies. These lowly shepherds knew this was the way that of their own wives, their own culture. They knew people like that. These were their people. Not only that, but lying in a manger. Instantly the shepherds knew that they were welcome because this was their domain. They lived in homes like this. The Christ child was not in a governor's mansion or a wealthy merchant's lodge, but in a simple 2-room home like their own. He was one of them. And right there, that is the breathtaking climax of God's scandalous message of reconciliation that we've been talking about this whole message series. That God's Son, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, was born among and for the poor, the lowly, the common, the rejected, the unpolished, the mess-ups, the outsiders, the sinners. He came for us, all of us. And the very account of his birth is a vivid picture of just how accessible he is to common humanity. And here's where the message of hospitality gets personal for us tonight. Jesus doesn't come to meet with us because of our decorated display coats of goodness and our impressive heritage. We don't woo him with our moral forthrightness and our fine record of behavioral excellence, that he might regard us an asset to his otherwise mediocre kingdom. No, we step into the presence of Jesus in our lowliness, in our lack of refinement, our raw, honest human selves. That's where Jesus meets us, in the common, unrefined peasant homes of our hearts. So my question for all of us this evening, is your heart and your life story a place of hospitality? Modest, imperfect, unimpressive as it may be, a place where Jesus could make a home. And I'm not throwing out some standard come to Jesus moment here where the regular churchgoers check out. Listen, just like our Middle Eastern pictures of hospitality, is your life, your heart, a place where the presence with Jesus, that relationship where it's initiated, cultivated, and deepened, even at great personal expense? Is it a place like our definition from earlier for the warm and generous reception of guests and strangers, often at notable personal cost or sacrifice? Revelation 3:20, Jesus says, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." This is a sobering picture to us of Jesus arriving at the doors of our lives and our hearts to gauge whether it's a place of hospitality. We're going to sing through a few familiar verses of Silent Night together in just a minute. We're going to be standing, and what I'm going to ask you to do as we sing together, I'm going to ask you to allow yourself some reflection time, some self-assessment on all of this, whatever that place looks like for you. So I'm going to ask us all, let's stand together and let's sing this evening, Silent Night. In his letter to the Ephesian church, the Apostle Paul writes this: "I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him." I can't think of a better way to end 2019 and to celebrate Christmas than to ask you to consider, maybe for the very first time, to just crack the door of your heart residence open and begin a conversation with Jesus, to do something with this Savior. If that's a personal decision you've never made, I encourage you to just not leave here without talking to someone. Grab me after the service if you're willing. We can pray and maybe talk about a time after the holidays to how to respond to that. But that's definitely not my only plea tonight, because there is a whole lot of ways that the dark of this world needs a whole lot more of the light of Jesus. And those of us who claim to follow Jesus, his church, if there is hurt and pain and brokenness that goes unaddressed in our midst, in our community, in our culture, in our neighborhood, that's on us. We're the peasant village that must be eager to let our lives be saturated with Jesus' scandalous message of reconciliation and healing and compassion and restoration. So if you've been following Jesus, but your life has not been a place of hospitality, it's not been a place that has cultivated and deepened that relationship, not been fully present in that relationship with Jesus, your little lamp in that peasant house is barely lighting up any square footage. If that's you, talk to me after. Talk to one of our leaders. You hear me say it so often on Sundays. If God is doing some stirring, trying to get your attention, don't ignore that. Don't leave without putting some kind of marker for yourself to respond to it, okay? Before we all head out tonight, we're going to collect an offering. Ushers, you can go ahead and get started with that. If you're visiting, as I said, consider putting your Connect cards in there. Offering is that time where we give back to God financially from what he's provided to us in the first place. And every Christmas Eve, we actually choose to take that offering and to give it away. We give it away. We send it to some endeavor that shines Jesus' light into places of shadows. So this evening's offering is going towards our own Brenna Baker's year-long missions and discipleship training called the World Race. It's through Adventures in Missions. She heads out in a few weeks, and we want to support her as she seeks to live out the light and message of Jesus in 11 different countries in the next year. So you can put your offerings and your cards in the plates as they come around. And while we are finishing doing that, I want to specifically and personally invite you to consider coming back in January. We're going to start a new message series called Living the Adventure. Living the Adventure. Bring the family, bring friends along with you. We're going to explore together what it looks like to fully live the lives, the adventure that God has called us to. It's going to be a great way to start off 2020.